It's my privilege to introduce our first presenter, who is Robert Swenson. Originally from Metropolis, Bob has lived in this region for most of his life. He's a Southern Illinois University Carbondale Professor Emeritus, as well as an accomplished architect, preservationist, and affordable housing advocate. He received an Illinois State Historical Society Lifetime Achievement Award in 2008. Bob's research on steamboats and shipyards, which has taken him from Ohio to Montana and from Wisconsin to Louisiana, has produced a book titled From the Center of America, Steamboats and Shipyards Along the Lower Ohio River, to be published next year by Southern Illinois University Press. His presentation is called Three Confluences, the Four Rivers Reach of the Lower Ohio River. Please welcome Robert Swenson.
What I want you to come away with by the time I'm finished, and I told Matt to bring a shepherd's hook to grab me and pull me off. I have a tendency to talk way too long, so confluences, why are they important? When I first thought about, I grew up in Metropolis on the Ohio River, which is not on the confluence. Fort Massac was my playground growing up. But I knew that in Paducah, there was the Tennessee River came into the Ohio and Paducah. And I knew about Cairo, where the Ohio ran into the Mississippi River. But I never really thought about it much, even though I grew up in a river town, because it was just a natural thing, the boat whistles and the train whistles going across the river. And I didn't think about intersections. River confluences are like the interstate highway intersections, where 57 runs into 55, where 24 runs into 57, and 64 runs into 70 and all kinds of other interstates at St. Louis. And it's that point where one has to make a decision. Where am I going to go next? Where do I need to go? What kind of signage do I need? And so it's a fork in the road, basically, which way to go next. If both rivers, now we're going to talk about rivers, if both rivers at that intersection are navigable, then that land, that intersection becomes really important to whoever controls it, because not only can they generate commerce, the reasons for the boats to stop there, or they can control it in terms of political power. They can stop boats from going past that or going up the wrong where they don't want them to go. If it becomes like Cairo, a really important intersection, it then becomes a place where there's a wharf, where there's warehouses, where there's a hotel, there's places for people to eat, because particularly at Cairo, the Mississippi and the Ohio, the water is different depending on the time of year. And boats often had to stop and cool their steamers down so that their boilers could be cleaned out and fresh water from a different river could be placed in the boilers. And so boats were Ohio River boats or Mississippi River boats as well. Some boats went all the way from Louisville or Cincinnati to New Orleans, but many boats just stayed on that particular river because of the water that's in that river. And so people had to get off the boat to wait for another boat to go somewhere else. Or the merchandise that was on the boat had to be unloaded and put in a warehouse, which was what Cairo became particularly famous for. Boats were repaired there. Money was borrowed there. And there were hotels and taverns and brothels. So all of those things that were important, to travelers were at these intersections. This map is from the Army Corps of Engineers. And the dark blue lines, for those of you who can see that, is called the Inland Waterways System, which is navigable rivers where towboats today can go. And it was in the 1800s, it's far more extensive. The Missouri River now stops at Kansas City in terms of navigability. But before that, it went all the way to Fort Benton, Montana, past the Yellowstone River, 2,500 miles from St. Louis. This is another picture of an early map, 1720 map of the Mississippi River system, which was the first river system to really be investigated on the western side of the Allegheny Mountains. And so Pittsburgh isn't even on this map. They didn't even realize that the Allegheny and Monongahela came together to form the Ohio. So Montreal, the Great Lakes, the French came down through the Great Lakes, came down the Illinois River to St. Louis area. Before it was St. Louis, came down past the confluence here at Cairo, went as far as the Arkansas River. And those were the major confluences at that particular time. So here we are, center Cairo, and here to Paducah is the very center of the entire river system. If you had strings to represent the river and you put them all and tied them in a big knot in the middle, this is where we are. This is the knot in the middle. And from here, from Cairo, you can get up to Minneapolis, you can get to Kansas City, 960, 70 miles north to Minneapolis. You can go up the Illinois River and get on the to Chicago, Lake Michigan. From Cairo south, you can go to New Orleans, 970 miles south to New Orleans. You can get on the Arkansas River and go as far as Oklahoma. You can go up the Ohio just 50 to 60 miles to Paducah, 48 miles to Paducah, and get on the Tennessee River and go all the way to Mobile, Alabama. Or you can go up the Ohio, 970 miles again. That 970 is a big number. As far as Pittsburgh, get on the Kanawha River, get on the Kentucky River, all kinds of Wabash, all kinds of other rivers up that direction. Or you can go to a little past Paducah to Smithland, where there's a tiny little town, and go down to Tennessee to Nashville, Tennessee, which was in the 1800s was the Athens of the South. It was a very productive community. This is what it looked like at Smithland. Flatboats, and I can't see this picture very well because of the angle that it's turned, but flatboats, steamboats were the primary way of getting around. This is what it looks like now. The Cumberland River goes off towards the south, and the Ohio River, and you can see the Smithland Dam up in here, and that's one of 40 some odd dams between to make the river navigable between Olmsted, which is the first one in this area, all the way to Pittsburgh. This is what it comes 16 miles downriver from Smithland, and the Tennessee River comes into the Ohio, and there's an island right at Paducah. If you've ever been to the waterfront at Paducah, you can see Owens Island there. People think that's really the Tennessee, but it's really not. It's on the other side. And it goes to Kentucky Lake and down to into Alabama, Muscle Shoals area of Alabama, and get on the Tombigbee waterway and make yourself all the way to Mobile, Alabama. This is what Paducah looks like today with Owens Island, and that arrow shows just around that bend is Smithland, Kentucky. I'm having a lot of trouble with the arrows here. I'm losing track. I can't get my finger on the right arrow button here. But anyhow, the French were the first to come into this region. They came out of Montreal, came down the Great Lakes, came down to what was now Chicago, came down the Illinois River to St. Louis, established Kaskaskia and Cahokia, Fort Deschartres. They didn't establish Cahokia, the Native Americans established Cahokia, excuse me. And then came down as far as the Confluence. The French went up the Ohio as far as Grand Chain, Illinois, which is about 20 miles up. She lived in Grand Chain, so. And established what was called Wabash, which is another way of pronouncing the Wabash River, because they didn't know what the Ohio was. They didn't know it went all the way to the Pittsburgh area. They knew it went up into Indiana. They could sense the Wabash River. They were hunting buffalo, so they went up in canoes up the Ohio and down the Tennessee. At one point, after the French, the British controlled this region, and the American, we have the Revolutionary War, and the Americans figured out how to take all that land north of the Ohio River, called the Northwest Territory. And you can see the white circle at the bottom. That's us. That's where we are. At the very, very tip of the Northwest Territory. And the whole Northwest Territory was basically settled from this area north. The major confluences are shown here. St. Louis, Fort Massac, all the way to our little section here is from Smithland to Paducah around to Cairo. So I call this area the Four Rivers Reach. For a long time I called it the Crescent of Illinois because of the crescent. But then when I realized that Smithland was really an integral part of the whole system in this knot, I couldn't call it the Crescent anymore because there was another hook on it. And I finally talked to steamboat pilots, or towboat pilots, excuse me, and realized that a reach is, in river terms, is from one landmark to another. There might be short reaches, like from Paducah to Fort Massac to Grand Chain to Olmsted to Cairo. But the Four Rivers Reach is this particular section from the Cumberland River to the Tennessee River, past Fort Massac, all the way down to here. So we have the Ohio, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, and the Mississippi, and three confluences. Fort Massac, 1796, but it was actually French in the 1750s. President Jefferson had a theory about how to settle and what the white men deserved to be able to do. It was called manifest destiny. Jefferson, as good as he was as a president, just felt that America could grow just by taking the land from whoever settled it first, from the Native Americans to whoever, and encouraged migration, encouraged people to go west down, and the Ohio River was the main pathway, was the main interstate at that time to go west. This is how they got there. Flatboats, small barges, mackinaws. We were able to, Mark Wagner and a man from Metropolis who found it, we were able to excavate a flatboat at America, Illinois, which is just up the river from here about 15 miles. And it was the only flatboat found that was actually excavated and studied out of thousands and thousands of flatboats that came down the Ohio, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers. Our area was first mapped by surveyors in 1796 or 1797, just about when Fort Massac was rebuilt by the Americans. In order to own land, you had to have a legal description of the land. You had to have its metes and bounds, its corners, and the surveyor started laying out from the third principal meridian, which starts at the confluence, northward all the way to Wisconsin. And then they went 1 mile squares each way, up and down, and the east-west of meridian was through Vincennes, Indiana, towards St. Louis. Cantonment Wilkinsonville was established by General Wilkinson in 1801. At the same time, the Spanish owned everything west of the Mississippi River, and Aaron Burr and General Wilkinson were conspiring to relocate 1/3 of the American Army military at that time to Wilkinsonville, and then move downriver and take all the land west of the Mississippi River. That was a conspiracy. And Wilkinson was also trying to prevent Lewis and Clark from making it all the way to, trying to find that route to. So Lewis and Clark, 1803, came here because this had been surveyed 5 years, 6 years earlier. There was a point at Cairo, at this confluence, that had coordinates, and all of their mapping, all the way from this area to Oregon to the Pacific, started here. All of it. And sextant, octants. There's a wonderful exhibit in the Custom House Museum here in Cairo that SIU got a grant from the Smithsonian a number of years ago and created an exhibit related to Lewis and Clark. So this drawing map shows how early our settlements were. And the first settlements in Illinois were in this section of the river, primarily because of these 3 confluences. (1811), steam. The Industrial Revolution had started and had made it over the Alleghenies from the Hudson River to Pittsburgh. And the first steamboat that was ever built on the west side of the Alleghenies was called the New Orleans. And it came down from Pittsburgh, past here during the New Madrid earthquake, exactly at that same very time, into the Mississippi and all the way to New Orleans. But it wasn't powerful enough to come back upriver. This is what the New Orleans looked like. It's probably closer to the top left of the side wheeler, and they built a replica 100 years later and recreated that trip. But these are two artist renditions of the steamboat to New Orleans. Okay. Within 10 years, 9 years, 1811 to 1820, at least 20 steamboats were built, but the first few, within 4 years, the New Orleans, the Comet, the Vesuvius, the Enterprise, Washington, Etna, and Zebulon Pike were built and went down the Ohio into the Mississippi as far as New Orleans. The Enterprise, which was built by Henry Shreve, who's a famous builder and pilot, actually was powerful enough to come back up the Mississippi to Cairo and then up to Louisville, to the Falls of Louisville. It was the first one to do that. And that's when the revolution was really started. Commerce could happen between the North and the South. This is what it looked like at Cave and Rock, Illinois, an artist rendition. So steamboats and flatboats were on the river at the same time. In the 1830s, the Missouri River was also active. Choteau and people in St. Louis, the French in St. Louis, were trappers and shippers of pelts, beaver and buffalo, from as far away as Fort Benton, Montana, and this was called the First American Fur Company. I wish I could read the side of this. So that's an arted rendition of what steamboats looked like at that time. So steamboat companies, factories, were starting to build boats, and this is an example of what they look like. And if one wanted a boat, ordered a boat, the builder would build a scale model of half of the hull, about this long, at a 1/4 inch scale, 1/4 inch equal a foot, and to make sure that the buyer said, well, that's the kind of hull I need for my particular river that I want this to serve. Slideshow.
Oh, sure.
And you're probably going to have to stop me.
We've got about 5.
Okay. Thank you. This is an example of what the edges of the rivers looked like where there were shipyards. And probably the first one in our area was at Smithland. In 1835, Andrew Jackson was a very powerful politician. And he ordered, in order to get land in the South to plant cotton, he ordered that the Native Americans from the Southern Appalachians be moved to Oklahoma. And and somebody mentioned earlier how important it is for different people to be doing research and share their research. I found out from Mary McCorvey, who's an archaeologist with the U.S. Forest Service. She was doing research on the Cherokee movement, and she said, "Bob, have you ever heard of a steamboat that the Cherokee used to move to Oklahoma?" And I said, "No, I didn't know they even went by steamboat." And so there were two trailatiers. There was the one in this dashed line that came out of Kentucky into Golconda area, came across southern Illinois to where, and crossed into Missouri. But there was another group, usually the more wealthy of the Cherokee, that all the way in Knoxville area, Chattanooga area in Tennessee, went onto the Tennessee River, south towards Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and then they had to be moved by wagon or train past the shoals to another group of steamboats that came up the Tennessee to Paducah, where they had to be unloaded for sure, because those boats on the Tennessee were different sizes, and fed and treated for medical reasons, get on an Ohio River steamboat, come to Cairo, probably be unloaded again to get on a Mississippi River steamboat to go down to the Arkansas River and unload it again onto a boat and go up the Arkansas River past Little Rock to Oklahoma. So that's another story I hope somebody will get to, and what they did in Cairo and this is what Cairo was going to be, the new U.S. capital. This is an artist rendition by William Strickland for what Cairo was supposed to look like. It was going to be, and you can see an obelisk, and you can see all the federal buildings. And somebody's going to talk about Charles Dickens, so I'll skip that. This is what things looked like at St. Louis in the 1840s. Cincinnati. The first steamboat built in Metropolis was the Keokuk in 1855. We don't have any photographs of steamboats built in Smithland or Paducah before that. I'm going to show you just a few of these just to give you a sense of scale. This was 301 feet long. A football field is 300 feet long, 100 yards, 300. So can you imagine somebody trying to guide a steamboat on the river that was made of wood that did this on the fluid and steer it around the bends on the rivers? I'm going to have to stop here, I think. So the main thing I want you to realize is that the Civil War was probably won from this area, from Cairo, by General Grant and Admiral Porter, mainly because of the confluence of these rivers. It was the deepest part into the south. And the gunboats that were built at Mound City and St. Louis accompanied the troops down the Tennessee and down the Cumberland to take Fort Donelson and other forts and divide up the South. And then they took troops down to Vicksburg and down the Mississippi to further divide up the South. So I think I need to stop.
Thank you so much, Bob. That's really fascinating, and I can't wait for From the Center of America. What questions and curiosities do you all have for Bob?
So, one is a fun fact. I've known Bob a long time. Bob designed the Community Health Emergency Center north of town, the clinic as you get off the interstate in 1991. So that's been a while, but I've known them since then. But I have a question. You had a slide about America. For those of us that may not know where America is and the importance, could you speak to that?
The town of
America. It's right north of Mound City. Right.
If
that road went on.
if you came from the north at the intersection just north of Cairo, Route 37 heads up towards West Vienna and Marion and all the way to Chicago. About 15 miles north of Cairo and Mound City is a field. You'll see a sign that says America that way.
Yeah, we were there last night.
And that's why the flatboat that we discovered and uncovered was titled American. But anyhow, America was established in about 1818, right? To become, I think they were also talking about the capital of the United States being there. But it suffered a health epidemic, smallpox or malaria or something like that. And plus the river moved the wharf away from, too far away from floods and moved it too far away from the town. So Cairo was established about the same time by entrepreneurs from Baltimore, Maryland. And so there was a competition, but Cairo won that competition. But America was supposed to be the center of America. And it was just 15 miles at the most upriver, the Ohio.
I have one more question. South of town, you mentioned Lewis and Clark. There's a monument there that speaks to the third meridian. Could you say a couple words about that?
In 1796, Andrew Ellicott was the main head surveyor for the U.S. government, and he was sent down the Ohio to survey the river all the way to the confluence. And at the confluence, they used sextants and octants and books that on this particular day and this particular time, the stars were in a particular position, and they could triangulate and give it coordinates. And so they established the coordinate at the mouth of the Ohio, and then they created a line called the third principal meridian. Their second meridian is somewhere in Indiana, Ohio. The third one, main meridian for property surveys, was started at Cairo, also in 1796.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And it's interesting that it actually crosses the river into Kentucky just a dab before it goes through Meridian School, right?
Exactly.
They need an elementary school north of Cairo, Meridian. Anybody else?
Other questions?
Yeah. You mentioned the New Orleans, that town steamboat coming from Pittsburgh, and I know something about that because I grew up in New Madrid County, and so two things about that steamboat. One thing, when people saw it coming down sort of during the quake, they actually thought the steamboat caused the quake. So that was one thing. And another thing was New Madrid, I think the epicenter was East Prairie, and the quake zone goes all the way up north to Cairo. That's the end of the rift zone. But when the steamboat passed, when it passed New Madrid, New Madrid, all the people were out there, please take us away. We're stuck. We're starving. But the steamboat was full, and they left them. They just went by. So those are two facts I know.
Well, this was during the earthquake too, right?
That's right. They wanted to be rescued, but the steamboat did not stop them. That's what I said.
It scared a lot of people,
Yeah.
just because of the noise and the smoke, and a lot of people thought, and the comet, one major comet, I can't remember what it was, also happened at the same time. So people blamed the earthquake and the comet on the steamboat.
Thank you very much. One more question.
In Arkansas, we've got a historic site that commemorates the mapping for the Lewis and Clark exhibit. It's down in Brinkley, Arkansas. And I was wondering how they were figuring out coordinates outside of that region in contrast to Cairo to figure out the surveying of it. Should I try to see that?
The coordinates.
Yeah. Down in Arkansas near Brinkley, there's a commemorative plaque that marks the surveying for the Lewis and Clark exhibit or expedition. And I was wondering how they were figuring out areas outside of Cairo to have the entrance point for marking some of the surveying things for the maps. Because you mentioned the one in our region, but when you get down to Arkansas, they were also marking to commemorate with the historical site too.
Who did the surveying in Arkansas?
It might have been Illinois. I'll have to look that up and get back with you. But it was interesting.
I'm a little hard of hearing, so let me see if I even come close to answering your question. Lewis and Clark were asked by Jefferson to also get the width of the Ohio and the width of the Mississippi at the confluence, at that particular coordinate. And they did that by triangulation, survey triangulation. So they sent people across the river and set up a flag. And so they then took their instrument and lined up on that flag. And then they sent people a distance they could actually measure up the Ohio, and then another one, and then they looked at their instrument by this. And then by trigonometry, knowing those angles, using trigonometry, they could figure out the distance across the Ohio, which they couldn't measure, because of the flowing water. So then they did the same thing across the Mississippi. They sent somebody across, lined up on that, then put a point up the Mississippi, a flag, measured that distance carefully, and then got those angles, and then they could measure that. Now, how they got the coordinate in the first place was by stars. They set up a point, and they knew from the book a particular star was here, and what that inclination was above the horizon, and what the angle was from north. And then they did another star and got that inclination and the measurement from north, and then they were able to triangulate, and I think they used a third star. Basically what our satellites do now, that's all triangulation from different satellites instead of stars.
So they need points about outside of the specific starting point to get the triangulation to figure out where everything's fitting in, right?
I'm sorry.
You would need points outside of your starting point to work on the survey.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's a matter of basic trigonometry.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Please
But
give
the
it.
books had to have the